We're here at Carleton University for the EU Strategic Partnerships Workshop, and I'm with Thomas Renard. He's a senior research fellow at Egmont Institute in Brussels and a professor at the Vesalius College. And thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
So, why is the EU concluding strategic partnerships with emerging countries?
Well, I think mostly for three purposes. The first purpose is what I would call self-reflective. Basically, it's about the EU asserting itself as a global power. It's about the EU trying to say, well, through this strategic partnership, we also claim to be a strategic partner. So there is this self-reflective dimension, which also has some kind of internal purposes. That is basically, well, the EU needs to coordinate itself, notably with its member states, which is very important. And these strategic partnerships are also meant to be internal coordination processes that would make the EU a more strategic actor when it comes to dealing with important emerging players like China and India, where basically member states have a lot of vested interest as well. The second purpose would be to deepen and broaden bilateral cooperation. So, of course, trade and investment is very important. You've seen deepening trade and investment between the EU and emerging powers. But also the idea is that these relationships should go beyond that. Basically, these countries are graduating from development aid. So basically, the point is that they no longer are recipient of EU's development money, but also now they should become partner in global development cooperation. They should also become partner in climate negotiations, in security, and so on and so on. And finally, third dimension, they should also be global partner. That is to say, basically, the strategic partnership is meant to go beyond the bilateral relationship to actually deliver on global issues, such as climate, such as development, but also issues related to global governance.
Mm-hmm. What is different or common between the different strategic partnership arrangements you mentioned with China, with other emerging powers like South Africa, Brazil, India? Do you see commonalities between these arrangements or differences?
Well, there are some similarities, but also they're very different, clearly. I used to say that they are not equal nor identical. When I say they're not equal, well, clearly some emerging powers like China or India are much bigger countries. They have a critical mass that South Africa or Mexico perhaps cannot compete with. And when I say they're not identical, by this I mean, well, they have different legal and political basis, for instance. So, for instance, some of these countries have political agreements. So with South Africa, with South Korea, the EU has signed a framework agreement, which is a political agreement, along with a free trade agreement, along with a security agreement, which is called a framework participation agreement that allows South Korea to participate to EU CSDP missions. Now, that is unique to South Korea. Only South Korea, among all of the emerging powers, has signed these three agreements, which is sometimes referred as the Trinity of the EU strategic partnerships. But when it comes to the other emerging powers, with some of them we have, or we started to negotiate free trade agreement. With some of them, it's been for a long time. So, for instance, we've been negotiating a free trade agreement with India for a long time. We might never get there. We might start negotiating a bilateral investment treaty with China, which is perhaps a notch below the free trade agreement because it relates only to investment, not to trade. But when it comes to South Africa, we just concluded an economic partnership agreement, which is still another kind of document. So every partnership is underpinned by different documents, different scope. And that is partly result and partly leads to very different types of relationships. So basically the relationship with China, for instance, is very broad, very comprehensive with 64 dialogues, whereas the relationship with Mexico is much more narrow, also more recent. It's a much more recent partnership signed in 2010, whereas the one with China dates back from 2003. So you have really different things there. At the same time, one can say that basically the objective is is for them to reach to the same level because they have the same purposes. So perhaps one could say, well, the partnership with Mexico will broaden, so perhaps we will see more and more dialogues with Mexico in the coming years. And perhaps some can say also that some partnerships, even though they're very different, they might also be more focused. So perhaps the partnership with Mexico or with South Africa or with South Korea will specialize perhaps a little bit more in specific areas, whereas the partnership with China will remain more comprehensive, more global, because China is also a bigger power to some extent.
Mm-hmm. In your remarks earlier, you were talking about European Union and China cooperation in the environmental field. And I'm wondering, just for day-to-day Europeans and Chinese in the environmental cooperation or in other areas, why are these agreements important?
Well, one could say that the strategic partnership does not really impact the life of daily citizens, because these are political agreements, and to some extent they are also rhetorical statements. But beyond the political agreement, beyond the rhetorical statements, they also state a number of objectives. And it is these objectives that could change the life of citizens. So basically it is the objective that EU and China want to do things together on the environment. They want to get to some kind of climate agreement, though they're not, they don't necessarily agree yet on the specifics of this agreement, but they want to do something about climate. They want to get greener. They want also to tap into the opportunities of a green economy. All of that has clear implications for citizens on both sides.
What's new in the EU's strategic partnerships with emerging powers? What are you going to look for going forward?
Well, two things really. One thing is the EU has now a new High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Federica Mogherini, who's succeeding to Catherine Ashton. And Mogherini, even actually before taking her new position, has stepped into the strategic partnership narrative. So a question was, are strategic partnerships going to survive a new administration, so to speak? And the answer clearly is yes. Federica Mogherini is referring to all these countries as strategic partners, and she's saying that she will try to really make this instrument work. At the same time, she's recognized the challenge of the relationship or the partnership with Russia by saying, well, actually, this strategic partnership may be on hold for the moment. So she's also agreed that the relationship with Russia will be a big challenge. She's also emphasized the relationship with China and with the US is also undergoing a little bit of challenging times because also undergoing very difficult negotiations with for TTIP with the US on a number of other issues related to security and cyber and so on, and security in Asia with China. So this is one thing that we will have to look for. The other thing that we will have to look for is the EU is actually undergoing a strategic reflection, which is called the strategic review, and basically at the EU level, there is and there will be in the coming month very important discussions about EU's foreign policy, basically about the EU's objectives and priorities when it comes to foreign policy, which could eventually, this is still to be confirmed, but which could eventually result in a new security strategy, which would not be an update of the 2003 European Security Strategy, but which would be really a new document. And in that document, we will see whether strategic partnerships find their way as an instrument, as a core instrument of EU's foreign policy, or whether the EU and EU people will try to tackle emerging and established powers through different in a different way. But these two things, I think, are very important developments in really the coming weeks and months.
Finally, I just wanted to ask, how is the EU strategy with these emerging countries coinciding with each individual European countries' strategies? Germany strategy, France's strategy, the UK's strategy with China or other emerging players. How do these work together or come into tension with an EU strategy?
Well, clearly there is an overlap between EU strategic partnerships and national strategic partnerships. So clearly, EU member states, a number of them at least, have their own strategic partnerships, which may or may not overlap, and that can be a challenge because, as we see very often with China, for instance, there is what's often referred as a scramble for China. So every member state wants its part of China's huge wallet, and so they're on the hunt for investment, trade, and so on and so on. And clearly, that is where the EU strategic partnerships become really important because, as I said earlier, it is about coordinating, providing a common narrative for dealing with China. And eventually, EU member states realize that because they realize that it's very difficult to talk to China, to influence and shape China's policies at the bilateral level. You really have to go through the EU to have any kind of impact on China. So that is a very important thing. But clearly also, and that should also be underlined and reminded, that the member states have played and continue to play the role in the shaping of EU strategic partnerships. To begin with, some member states clearly drove the decision for establishing some of these EU strategic partnerships. So, for instance, the strategic partnership with India was established under British presidency of the European Union, or the one with Brazil was established under Portuguese presidency of the European Union. So there clearly was an influence at the very beginning from some of the member states, but also still continuously through the various EU processes, through the various council meetings of all kinds, dealing with all types of issues. Every member state is represented there, and so every member state, in a way, is shaping the EU's policies, the EU strategic partnerships with these countries. So there is overlap, but at the same time, there is possible synergies, reinforcement efforts as well. So I think that should work.
Happy you're optimistic. Thank you so much for your time, Thomas, and enjoy the rest of your time in Ottawa.
Thank you very much. A pleasure.